You'd think nobles with their wealth kept food the longest. Dead wrong. Peasants, the poorest of the poor, preserved meat for 2 winters straight using something so obvious we've completely forgotten it. The strangest part? You probably have everything needed already in your home. You know what's funny about medieval peasants? While we're panicking about our meat going bad after 3 days in the fridge, these folks were making their Sunday roast last until next Christmas. And their secret weapon? Something sitting right there in your kitchen cabinet. Salt wasn't just seasoning back then, it was liquid gold. Well, crystalline gold, but you get the point. These medieval folks treated salt like we treat our smartphones today. Absolutely essential for survival. Here's the thing about salt that blew my mind when I first learned this. It doesn't just make food taste better. Salt is basically a moisture vampire. It sucks every drop of water out of meat faster than your uncle drains a beer cooler at family reunions. And bacteria, those little troublemakers that spoil our food, they hate dry environments more than cats hate bath time. The process was brutally simple. Pack the meat in salt. Wait, more salt. Wait some more. Think your blood pressure medication warnings are serious? Medieval peasants were creating meat so salty it could probably cure leather boots. But here's where it gets interesting. And this is something most people don't realize. A single pig, properly salt cured, could feed a family of 6 through 2 brutal winters. 2 winters. That's like buying groceries once and not going back to the store for 24 months. Try explaining that to your local Walmart manager. The downside? Well, eating this meat was like licking the Dead Sea. Before cooking, they had to soak it for hours, sometimes overnight, just to make it edible without sending someone into sodium shock. My grandmother used to do something similar with her ham, and let me tell you, watching her change that soaking water 3 times taught me patience I didn't know I had. What really gets me is how precious salt was. In some regions, a pound of salt costs the same as a day's wages. That's like spending $60 on table salt today. Makes you appreciate that Morton's container a little more, doesn't it? Medieval salt merchants were basically drug dealers, but legal. They controlled the preservation game completely. No salt meant no preserved meat. No preserved meat meant starvation when winter hit hard. The power these guys held was incredible. And the crazy part? This wasn't just about survival. Salt-cured meat became such a staple that entire trade routes developed around it. Towns built their economies on preserved pork. Families passed down salting techniques like secret recipes. The peasants who mastered this art didn't just survive, they thrived. Their neighbors came knocking when food ran short, trading whatever they had for a chunk of that perfectly preserved meat. But salt was just the beginning of their preservation arsenal. What they did with smoke would make your backyard barbecue look like child's play. Now here's where things get interesting. While their neighbors were stuck with meat that tasted like a salt lick, some clever peasants discovered something that would make their preserved meat actually enjoyable to eat. Smoking wasn't just about preservation, it was about creating flavor that could make even the toughest cuts of meat taste like a feast. But here's the kicker. Most people think medieval folks just hung meat over a fire and called it good. Wrong. These weren't amateurs fumbling around with campfire cooking. The real pros built dedicated smoking chambers. We're talking about structures that would make modern pitmasters weep with envy. They knew exactly which woods to use: oak for that deep, earthy taste, apple for sweetness, or hickory when they wanted to get serious about flavor. Cherry wood? That was their secret weapon for color and taste. But why did smoking work so well for preservation? Simple chemistry, really. The smoke contains natural chemicals called phenols, nature's own preservatives. These little molecular warriors create a protective barrier on the meat's surface while the slow, low heat drives out moisture. No moisture means bacteria can't throw their spoilage party. Here's what blew my mind when I first learned this. Medieval peasants understood temperature control better than half the people using fancy smokers today. They'd adjust airflow by moving stones, create different heat zones, and maintain consistent temperatures for days. No thermometers, no digital controls, just pure skill passed down through generations. The funny thing is, smoking had one major drawback that salt curing didn't. You needed constant babysitting. Someone had to tend that fire, monitor the smoke, and make sure everything stayed just right. It was like having a very delicious, very demanding pet that could feed your family through winter if you didn't mess up. And talk about community effort. Smoking became a neighborhood event. Families would pool resources, share techniques, and help each other manage multiple smoking sessions. Your meat might be hanging next to your neighbor's, creating this weird medieval version of a block party. The results were incredible, though. Properly smoked meat could last 6 months or more without refrigeration. Plus, and this is the part that really matters, it actually tasted good. Unlike salt-cured meat that required extensive soaking and still tasted like the Dead Sea, smoked meat was ready to eat and packed with flavor. Some villages got so good at this that their smoking techniques became legendary. Travelers would detour just to trade for their preserved meats. It was like having the medieval equivalent of a 5-star restaurant, except instead of Michelin stars, you got survival through brutal winters. But even smoking had its limitations, especially when winter hit hard and wood became scarce. That's when our resourceful peasants turned to something even more ingenious. Winter was basically nature's gift to medieval peasants who needed to keep meat fresh. While everyone talks about salt and smoke, the real game changer was right there falling from the sky. These clever folks figured out that cold temperatures could slow down the nasty bacteria trying to ruin their precious protein. Makes sense, right? No fancy technology needed, just good old-fashioned ice and snow doing what modern freezers do today, minus the electric bill. But here's where it gets interesting. Medieval peasants weren't just throwing meat into a snowbank and calling it a day. They developed surprisingly sophisticated ice storage systems that would make your grandfather's root cellar look amateur. They'd dig deep pits in the ground, sometimes 8 to 10 feet down, then line them with stones and straw. The meat went into wooden barrels or clay pots, packed tight with ice and snow, layer after layer, like building a frozen lasagna of preservation. These underground ice houses could keep meat good for months, even when spring started knocking at the door. Well, here's the kicker. Some communities got so good at this that they'd harvest ice from frozen ponds and rivers during the coldest months. They'd cut it into blocks, store it in insulated buildings packed with sawdust, and ration it out through the warmer seasons. Talk about planning ahead. The beauty of ice preservation was its simplicity. No special ingredients needed, no complex processes to master. Just nature doing what she does best, keeping things cold and bacteria at bay. Even a 10-year-old could understand the concept, though the execution required some serious muscle. And the weird part is, different regions developed their own ice storage tricks. Mountain folk had natural caves that stayed cold year-round. Coastal communities learned to pack meat with sea ice that lasted longer than regular frozen water. Some villages even built communal ice houses, sharing resources like an ancient version of a neighborhood food co-op. Of course, ice preservation had its limitations. You needed consistent cold weather, which meant this method worked best in northern climates or during harsh winters. Plus, ice has this annoying habit of melting, so constant replenishment was crucial. Miss a few days of maintenance, and your carefully preserved winter supply could turn into a smelly disaster. The statistics from medieval records show that communities with access to reliable ice storage had significantly lower rates of food poisoning and winter starvation. Smart planning meant the difference between thriving and barely surviving those brutal cold months. But even the most ingenious ice storage system couldn't compete with one particular preservation method that medieval peasants stumbled upon, one that didn't depend on weather, seasons, or constant maintenance. This technique was so effective that some families could preserve enough meat to last through 2 complete winters, using nothing more than common household ingredients and a bit of medieval ingenuity. Medieval peasants discovered something that would make modern food scientists jealous. Vinegar could turn spoiling meat into a preserved delicacy that lasted months. While their neighbors watched perfectly good protein rot away, these clever folks were dunking their meat in what basically amounted to liquid preservation magic. The secret wasn't really a secret at all. Vinegar's acidity creates an environment so hostile to bacteria that even the most determined microbes throw in the towel. We're talking about a pH level that makes spoilage organisms more uncomfortable than a tax collector at a peasant's wedding feast. But here's where it gets interesting. These weren't just random splashes of vinegar we're talking about. Medieval cooks developed elaborate pickling brines that would make your grandmother's pickle recipe look like child's play. They'd combine vinegar with salt, creating a double-barreled preservation system that hit bacteria from 2 different angles. The process itself was surprisingly sophisticated. Meat would be cut into manageable chunks. Think medieval meal prep. then submerged in clay crocks filled with this acidic solution. The vinegar didn't just sit on the surface like some lazy preservative, it penetrated deep into the muscle fibers, essentially turning the entire piece of meat into an inhospitable environment for decay. Now, let's be honest about the downside. This wasn't exactly fine dining material. The meat came out tasting like it had been marinated in liquid pucker. Some folks described it as eating something that had been arguing with a pickle barrel and lost. Badly. Yet entire communities would gather for what they called pickling days. Picture this: half the village huddled around massive vats, everyone contributing their winter meat supply to a communal preservation effort. It became less about individual survival and more about neighborhood teamwork with a side of gossip. The really clever part? Different regions developed their own signature vinegar blends. Some added herbs, others threw in spices, and a few brave souls experimented with fruit vinegars. These weren't just preservation techniques, they were the foundation of local culinary traditions that survived for centuries. Medieval records show that pickled meat became such a staple that it featured prominently at important feasts. Lords and peasants alike served these tangy preserved cuts alongside fresh fare, creating flavor contrasts that medieval taste buds apparently found delightful. Who knew sour could be so popular? The technique worked so well that many households could stretch their meat supplies through 2 full winters without losing a single morsel to Achtus. Spoilage. That's not just impressive, that's the difference between surviving harsh seasons and facing starvation. But even vinegar had its limitations, and smart peasants knew better than to rely on just one preservation method. They had another trick up their sleeves that involved something every kitchen already had in abundance. Medieval peasants didn't just rely on salt and smoke to keep their meat fresh. They had another trick up their sleeves that would make your grandmother's spice rack jealous. These clever folks discovered that certain herbs and spices weren't just flavor enhancers. They were natural preservatives with serious antimicrobial powers. Rosemary, thyme, sage, and cloves became the unsung heroes of medieval kitchens. While calling them kitchens might be generous, most peasants had what we politely call cooking corners that would make modern health inspectors faint faster than a Victorian lady at a medical lecture. But here's where it gets interesting. These herbs contained natural compounds that actually fought off bacteria and mold. Rosemary has rosmarinic acid, thyme packs thymol, and cloves deliver eugenol, though medieval peasants just knew they worked, not why. They were basically running a chemistry lab without knowing the first thing about chemistry. The process was surprisingly sophisticated for people who thought bathing was optional. They'd coat their meat with crushed herbs, sometimes mixing them with coarse salt to create what we might call the world's first seasoning rub. Then they'd wrap the whole thing in cloth or stuff it into clay pots, creating little herb-scented time capsules. And the weird part is, this method worked so well that some families developed secret herb blends passed down through generations like precious heirlooms. Your great-great-great-grandmother's special mix of herbs wasn't just about taste, it was literally keeping the family alive through brutal winters. The downside was obvious, though. Getting these herbs wasn't like strolling down to the local grocery store. Peasants had to grow them, dry them, and store them properly. One bad harvest or a particularly harsh winter could leave them scrambling for alternatives. Makes sense why they never relied on just one preservation method, right? Monastery records from the period reveal some fascinating details about these herbal techniques. Monks, being the record keepers of their time, documented which combinations worked best for different types of meat. Apparently, lamb responded better to rosemary and thyme, while pork preferred sage and juniper berries. Who knew medieval monks were basically food scientists in robes? The really clever peasants would layer their preservation methods. They'd salt the meat first, then coat it with herbs, and maybe add a light smoking session for good measure. It was like wearing a belt with suspenders. Redundant maybe, but your pants weren't falling down. This herbal approach also had an unexpected social benefit. When Preservation Day came around, neighbors would share herbs and techniques, turning a chore into a community event. Nothing brings people together quite like the shared fear of starvation. But even with all these herbal tricks, peasants still needed one more crucial technique to guarantee their meat would last through the harshest conditions. This final method was so effective, it could seal meat away from its biggest enemy. Medieval peasants discovered that wrapping meat in a thick blanket of fat was like creating nature's own vacuum-sealed storage system. They'd take chunks of freshly slaughtered pork, beef, or whatever they could get their hands on, then completely bury it in rendered lard or beef suet. The fat acted as an impenetrable barrier, keeping oxygen away from the meat like a medieval bodyguard protecting royalty from unwanted visitors. This technique worked brilliantly because bacteria need air to throw their spoilage party. No air, no party. Simple as that. The process itself was pretty straightforward, even for folks who couldn't read or write. You'd render down pig fat or beef tallow until it became liquid gold in your cooking pot. Then you'd place your meat in ceramic crocks or wooden barrels and pour that hot fat right over everything until the meat disappeared completely under a thick, creamy layer. As the fat cooled and solidified, it formed an airtight seal that would make modern food scientists weep with joy. But here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't just preservation, it was portable preservation. Unlike those heavy salt barrels or smoking sheds, fat-sealed meat could travel. Merchants heading to distant markets, soldiers marching off to battle, or families relocating to new villages could pack these fat-sealed treasures and have fresh meat weeks later. It was like having a medieval lunchbox that never spoiled. The downside, well, you need a lot of fat, and I mean a lot. Poor families who could barely afford to slaughter one pig a year had to make tough choices. Use all that precious lard for cooking throughout the winter, or gamble it all on preserving meat? Not exactly an easy decision when your family's survival hung in the balance. Then there was the mess factor. Getting that solidified fat off the meat later was like trying to remove candle wax from your grandmother's good tablecloth. It required patience, warm water, and probably a few choice medieval curse words. Smart peasants learned to reuse the fat multiple times. After eating the preserved meat, they'd melt down that same fat again for the next batch. Waste not, want not. Especially when winter lasted 6 months and spring felt like it might never arrive. The really clever ones mixed herbs into their fat before sealing. Rosemary, thyme, or garlic would infuse the meat with flavor while adding extra antimicrobial punch. It was like seasoning and preserving rolled into one brilliant technique. This fat sealing method eventually evolved into what French cooks later called confit, though they probably never credited those ingenious medieval peasants who figured it out first. Makes sense, right? But even this foolproof preservation method had its limitations, especially when peasants needed techniques that could work year-round without requiring precious resources. Now here's where medieval peasants accidentally stumbled onto something that would make modern steakhouse chefs weep with envy. Dry aging, though they probably called it hanging the meat until it stops dripping everywhere. The process was beautifully simple, like most brilliant discoveries born from desperation. You'd hang your freshly butchered meat in a cool, dry place with good airflow, maybe the corner of a barn, or if you were fancy enough to have a root cellar, that worked too. The key was finding that sweet spot, cold enough to prevent spoilage, but not so cold it froze solid. What happened next was pure kitchen magic, though they had no clue about the science behind it. Natural enzymes in the meat started breaking down tough muscle fibers, essentially tenderizing the meat from the inside out. Meanwhile, moisture slowly evaporated from the surface, concentrating flavors like a medieval reduction sauce. The outer layer formed what we'd now call a pellicle, basically a protective crust that sealed the good stuff inside. Think of it as nature's own vacuum packaging, except it actually improved the flavor instead of making everything taste like plastic. But here's the kicker. This wasn't just preservation, it was accidental gourmet cooking. The meat developed complex, nutty flavors that would make a modern, dry-aged ribeye jealous. Medieval peasants were creating delicacies without even trying, while nobles were probably still gnawing on fresh, flavorless chunks. Of course, it wasn't foolproof. Hang it too long in warm weather, and you'd get more mold than a teenager's bedroom. Too much humidity meant rot instead of aging. Many peasants learned the hard way that green fuzz wasn't a seasoning. The real genius was in the timing. During late fall slaughter, when temperatures dropped consistently, meat could hang for weeks or even months. By the time spring arrived, what started as a tough old cow had transformed into something tender enough for Grandpa's remaining teeth. Space was always an issue, though. Not everyone had a barn with perfect conditions, and competing for hanging spots probably caused more neighbor disputes than borrowed plows. Plus, you needed nerves of steel to resist cutting into that beautiful piece of meat while your stomach growled through winter. What's fascinating is how this necessity-driven technique laid the groundwork for luxury dining centuries later. Those peasants hanging meat in drafty barns were essentially pioneering the same methods used in high-end restaurants today, where dry-aged beef sells for more per pound than most medieval families saw in a month. The patience required was extraordinary. Waiting weeks for food to improve when you're already hungry takes serious willpower. Yet this waiting game created some of the most flavorful preserved meat possible, proving that sometimes the best things really do come to those who wait. Even the scraps weren't wasted. That crusty outer layer got trimmed off and tossed into stews, adding rich, concentrated flavor to otherwise bland winter meals.